Hey guys, welcome to my tutorial on how to create security cameras in your game. So just real quick, this map is just a map that I happen to have. I'll put a link to it. It's in the marketplace. You don't need it by any means to do this tutorial. I just have it so we have something nice to look at and you can kind of get a feel for where you're at when we're switching between cameras. So basically the way it works is there's this little control panel that you can place wherever you want. And if you walk up to it and interact with it, you'll see it will bring you up to the first security camera, and you can cycle between them with the A key and the D key, so you can go back and forth, and then you can press F again to exit out of it. So again, the way it works is there's just the security control center, and then there's cameras in the world. So you can see up here I have a camera. This is one of my security cameras, and over here, and I have another one. Yeah, right here, and I think I have another one somewhere over here. Yeah. So the idea is that you can just, if you want to put another security camera, you just copy one of these guys and move it somewhere else in the world. Like maybe we'll just put it down, look at these logs or whatever, and then you just come over to the security control center and you add a new security camera and you select the one you just placed. And you can see if we go ahead and we run this now, we walk up to it. If I go over, you can see now this is showing our new camera. So that's basically what we're creating, and you can see it has a nice like gradient effect to it to kind of make it look like it's more of a security camera, and it's obviously black and white. So I'll be showing you how to do all of that. But yeah, it's pretty simple, really easy to use once you have it set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and load up a new project that has this map fully loaded, because that will take a minute or two to load all of this again. And again, you obviously you don't need this map or any map in particular to follow this tutorial. And this one will be linked in the description if you want to download it and check it out. But I'm just using it purely for aesthetics. So I will be back as soon as the next map loads. All right, so I've now just created a brand new project using the third person template. And you can see I just have the default little level here. And all I've done is just added that abandoned factory content to this project. So I'm just going to go ahead and switch over to that map that I was on before. Again, it's just purely so we have something nice to look at. Okay, so here we are in our map. If we go ahead and run it, it just runs the default mannequin guy. There's no security cameras. So we'll be doing this totally from scratch. So the first thing we're going to want to do is, I guess we can create our blueprints for our security camera and our controls panel. So back in the content directory, I'm just going to create a new folder called security, I can't see, security cameras. And inside of here, we're going to right click and create a new blueprint. And it's going to be of type actor. And this will just be called the control panel, or actually BP underscore control panel. And then we want another one. So right click and say blueprint class. And again, this is going to be an actor, and we will call this BP security camera. And the last thing we're going to want is we need an interface to handle interacting with objects. So to do that, we'll right click and go to blueprint class, or no, that's not right. Right click and go to blueprints and go to blueprint interface. And we will call this the interaction interface. And again, this interface is just going to help us handle interacting with objects, specifically the control center in this case, or the control panel. Okay, so I guess we can go ahead and start working on this first, because we're going to need to be able to interact with our control panel before we can actually do anything else. So double click on the interaction interface, and it should open up like this. And we just want to add one function in here. You can see it already has one, so we're just going to rename it to on interaction. And we need to have it taken a parameter for the player that's doing the interaction. So say new parameter, and this is going to take in a third person character, or whatever the character is for the project that you're using. And we'll just call this player. We can compile and save that, and then we can actually close this because we don't need to do anything else. And once we have that created, we can I guess, start setting up our control panel. So go into the BP control panel, and that should open up a window like this. And we need to add some sort of visual representation of our control panel. Like in an ideal world, we'd have an actual model of some like computers and stuff, but I don't actually have any of that. So we're just going to use a simple little box. So I guess we'll do a static mesh. So add a static mesh component and just search for box. Or maybe cube is what it's called. 1 meter cube. This looks good. And then I'm just going to scale this a little bit by like 3 on the Y. There we go. So this is kind of simulate our desk. Again, in your project, you would get an artist to make you something that looks nice. And then we need some sort of collision on it so that we know when we're in front of it so that we can interact with it. So I'm going to add a box collision. So up here, add component. We want to go with box collision. And by default, it adds it kind of inside, which we don't really want. So I'm going to drag this out to the front and just have it scaled a little bit so it kind of better fits the box. So basically the idea is that whenever the player gets inside of this box, they'd be able to interact with it. So if you wanted it to be, that they can interact with it from any side, then you'd make it, much bigger like this or something. But yeah, I just want them to be able to interact with it from the front. So I'm just going to put it like this. We can compile and save that. And then we want to go to the event graph because we're going to need to hook up some basic events to this. So the first thing we need to know is if the player walks up to it and interacts with it. And to do that, we're going to actually make use of that interaction interface that we just created. So we can actually go ahead and delete all these because we don't need them. And back in the class settings at the top, we want to add the interaction interface, like so. And if we compile and save that, you can see over here on the left, it says on interaction. So it's basically prompting us to implement this event. So we can just right click on it and say implement function, like so. So essentially this is going to get called whenever the player interacts with the object. So for right now, I'm just going to say print string and just say something like interacted with control panel, just so we can test it once we get this working. But currently nobody's actually calling this event, so we need to go back to the player blueprint and hook it up so that when the player presses a specific key, it's going to check if he's interacting with any interactable objects, and if he is, he'll call this event. So to do that, go back to the content directory, and we want to go to, you want to go to your characters blueprint. For you guys, if you're just making a default project, it's going to be in the third-person blueprint's third-person character. But since I'm using this map, there's actually another character. But basically, you just want to do this in whatever character you're using in your game. And I believe it's in here for me. Yes, okay. So this is the character that's being used in my game. And it's the same character blueprint that gets added in the templates. So it should look pretty familiar. So inside of here, we essentially want to check if when the player presses a key, if we're overlapping with any interactable objects. And if we are, we want to try to interact with them. So to do that, we need to first define a key. So we're going to go to the project settings. So you can go to Edit, Project Settings, and go over to Input. And then up the top here, we have action mappings. We want to add an action mapping for interaction. So hit the plus key, or the plus button, and we'll say interact. And we'll set this to, I'm going to use F. You can use any key that you want. Will work just fine. And then back in the third-person character, we can now create an event that gets triggered whenever we press F. So we'll say input interact, and you can see right here we have our interact event. So this is going to get called whenever the F key is pressed. And like I said before, essentially what we want to do is check if we're overlapping with any interactable objects, and if we are, we want to interact with them. So to do that, we can right-click and type get overlapping actors, and bring in this guy. And we can say for each, so loop over all the objects, or all the actors that we are overlapping with, and we want to know if they implement the interaction interface. So to do that, we can cast it to interaction interface, and you're probably going to have to uncheck this context sensitive box up here to be able to see this. So cast to interaction interface is the one we want. And we'll hook that up. So if it failed, then that means it's not an interactable object, and we don't care about it. But if it succeeds, then it is an interactable object, and we want to call on interaction. So we can drag off of this and call on interaction, like so. And make sure you have this hooked up to the true and not the cast failed. And the player is ourself, so we can right click and say get ref to self. Yeah, get a reference to self and hook that up. And one thing we're actually going to have to change about this, if you're overlapping with more than one interactable object, you probably don't want to interact with both of them. So you really want to break out of this for loop as soon as you find one that you can interact with. So you can actually right click, and there's a for loop that has a break in it. So you can say for each with break. So for each with break. And you can see it's the same thing, but it has this extra break pin right here. So we want to actually replace this one with the break one, so we can make use of the break and just hook it up like we had it before, just like that. Except the break we want to hook up to this. So take this and drag it back around here. And I'm just going to make some reroute nodes so it's a little more clear what's going on here. And we don't need this to be so big. So yeah, so that's generally the idea. Once we find one of them that we can interact with, we're going to go ahead and break out of this loop so that we're not trying to interact with more than one object. So now, if we go ahead and we run this, I think we're going to run into one problem that we should probably fix real quick. If you go back to the control panel, I just want to make sure that the box's collision is set to, oh, okay, it already is. It's already set to overlap all, so we should be good. So if we go ahead and rerun this now, oh, I forgot to actually spawn one in the world. Duh. So by default, my character is spawning over here. I'm going to move him just so he's a little closer to where I want to put this control panel. Put him over here. And then I'm going to drag in the control panel, which I put here. So dragging this guy and kind of rotate him so he's facing the right way, like so. Okay, so if I come over here and I press F, you can see at the top, once that little message goes away, it says interacted with control panel. And if I press F over here or somewhere else, it does not. So now we have it successfully interacting with this control panel. The next step is obviously to hook up the cameras and being able to cycle through them. So go ahead and save this. Okay, so back over here, the next thing we need to do is fill out our security cameras. So open up the control panel again, and we're going to add a variable inside of here for our cameras. So under variables, click the variable plus, and we want it to be called security cameras. And the type we want is BP underscore security camera object reference. And we want to change it to an array so that we can specify a list of them. Compile and save that. And we want to check, if you click on it, we want to check that it's instance editable. That way we can edit it in the world. And we can also say that it's blueprint read only because we're not going to want to change these cameras at runtime. And we want it to be private because nobody else needs access to this. So these are our cameras. So if we come back to our world and we click on our control panel, you can see over here on the right now, it's exposed this array of security cameras. So if we click the plus button, we can add one, but there's currently none to add because none of them exist in the world yet. So we can go ahead, and I'm just going to add one of them right now, just so we can kind of test it. So if we drag in a security camera, right now there's nothing to this, it's just an empty actor. But you can see if I were to click on this guy and hit the drop down, you can see our security camera now exists. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that right now. So obviously we need to add a camera to our security camera actor. So we'll do that next. So double click on the security camera. And inside of here, we just want to add to our default scene route, we want to add a camera like so. Save this. And in order to make it have that nice black and white and gradient looking effect, there's a few things you can set down here on the lens, I think is where I set it. I'm gonna have to look at my other project real quick to remember exactly what I changed. Okay, so yeah, so it's under lens, and then it's under image effects. So I checked all three of these, and you can play around with these to see exactly what they do, but they basically just make it have that grittiness to it, or that grain to it. And I have it set to 0.5, uh, 0.5, and 0.5. And again, feel free to change these however you want. And then in order to make it black and white, if you go down to color grading and you click on global and you check saturation and then expand it and you drag this down to 0, which basically means no saturation, it'll make it look black and white. So if we go back to our camera now and we click on it, you can see in this little preview over here on the right, it has that grainy effect to it, and it's kind of black and white, which is exactly what we want. So I'm just going to have it facing like over this way for right now, and we'll just have one camera. Okay, so now we have our camera set up, and we have our camera attached to our control panel. We need to write the code that makes it so that once you walk up and interact with the control panel, it actually switches your view over to this camera up here. So go back to the BP control panel, and we're going to delete this print string and actually write some functionality here. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check a few conditions. We want to make sure that the control panel has at least one camera attached to it, because otherwise there's really nothing to do. And we also want to make sure that nobody else is occupying this, because if you're using this in a multiplayer game, you don't want to have two people on the control panel at one time. So to do that, we're going to make two little functions here to kind of help us out. One of them is going to be called has cameras, ? And this can be pure, and it can be constant, and it can be private. And I'm going to also add it to a private category just to keep things nice and neat. So this is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to say drag in our security cameras, and we're going to say length, and if the length is int greater than 0, then we're going to return that value. So if we have cameras, it's going to return true, and if we don't have any cameras, it's going to return false. And then, like I said before, we want to make sure that it's not being occupied by another player. So I'm just going to go ahead and right-click on this and say duplicate, and rename it to occupied ? And so inside of occupied, again, it's going to be really simple. We just want to make sure that there isn't another player on it. So we're going to need to keep track of that. So go ahead and create a player variable, like so, and just call it occupied player. And this needs to be set to a third person character, whatever your base class is for your characters. And we'll just call this, we already named it occupied player. And make sure it's not an array, because it's just going to be one of these guys. And we can set this to private. So inside of here, we just want to say occupied player is valid, and we want to return that. So if the occupied player is valid, then that means there is somebody else already occupying this, and if it's not, then that means nobody else is occupying this. So now back in our event graph, we can say, we can drag in has cameras, and we can drag in occupied, and we want to do an and, so we'll say and boolean. So we're checking if it has cameras and it's not occupied already, so we're going to say not boolean. So if both of these are true, so we can drag off of this and say branch. So if both of these are true, if it has cameras and there's nobody currently occupying it, then we can actually change the player's view to the security cameras. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to save this player variable that gets passed in as our occupied player, because this is the guy that's trying to occupy the control panel. So drag in our occupied player, and off of true, hook that up, and I'm going to hook player up to occupied player, and just kind of reroute it so it's a little cleaner, like so. And the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the player's input is disabled when he's on the security camera, because we don't want the player to be walking around or jumping whenever he's in the security camera view. So to do that, we need access to the player controller, and we almost have that because we have access to the player character. So we can get the player controller by saying get controller. And since it's the player, we know that it's going to have a player controller, so we can safely cast to a player controller. And we can convert this to a pure cast since we're sure it's going to succeed just fine. And we want to disable the input, so we will say drag off of the player and say disable input. And for the player controller, we will hook up our player controller, like so. So we've disabled the input for the player, but we still want the player to have some input because we want them to be able to press A and D to switch between the different security cameras, and we also want them to be able to press the F key again to get out of it. So in order to do that, we want to enable input for ourselves. So we can right-click and say enable input, and we'll leave the target as ourself, and the player controller is again this player controller right here. So now we have we've made sure that we can access the security camera because nobody else is there and it has cameras. We've saved a copy of the occupied player, and we have disabled input for the player and enabled input for ourselves. And the last two things we want to do is we want to take over control of the camera. So we want to save the current camera that we're on, like the index of the current camera we're out there on, so that we can cycle between them. So to do that, we're just going to create one more variable, and it's going to be called active camera index. And we want this to just be an integer because it's an index. And we can again set this to private. So by default, whenever you first interact with it, we're going to drag this in and we're going to set it to 0. So you're always going to start out on whatever the first camera is. And after that, we essentially want to just set the view. So I'm going to make a function for that. And it's going to be called set view target as active camera. So back here, we'll just call that real quick, like so. Oh, and we want this to also be private. So drag it into the private category and set it to private. You don't want other people calling this. Okay, so inside of here is where we're going to actually switch the camera over. So there's a handy function called set view target with, I have to uncheck this, with blend. Yeah, set view target with blend. And we're eventually going to be calling this. We just need to figure out some of these parameters here. So the target is the player controller that we want to switch the view for. And again, we can get that from our occupied player. So drag in our occupied player and say get controller. I'm going to recheck this again so I can get more context sensitive stuff. Why is that not showing? Get controller. What the heck? Is this not the right third person character? Why is this not showing up? Get controller. Okay, now it is. I don't know why it wasn't showing up before. I had to compile, I guess. So we get the controller, and we will cast to our player controller. And again, we know it's a player controller, so we can convert this to a pure cast. And that is our target. And the next thing it wants is the new view target, which is essentially the camera. So to get that, we can just drag in our security cameras array and say get a copy. And the copy that we want, the index that we want, is our active camera index. So whichever camera is currently active is the one we want to switch to, and we'll hook that up. And if we compile and save this, we should get a little check mark. Everything's good to go. So back in our event graph, we can probably go ahead and run this and test it now, assuming I didn't mess up anything. We won't quite be able to leave the security camera, but we'll at least be able to get into it. So if we go ahead and play, I walk up and I press F. You can see it switches my view to the security camera that we created a few seconds ago, or a few minutes ago. But currently I'm stuck in here. I can't walk around, which is good, but I also can't press F to exit, so we're kind of stuck in the security camera. So we need to write the code to both cycle between cameras and exit. So the first thing I'm going to do is write the code to exit, because that's pretty simple. So back here in the event graph, we can just listen for the interaction event because we know that that's the key that they press to get into it. So we can say input interact. So input action interact. So when this is pressed, we know that they're trying to leave the the control panel. So we essentially kind of want to do the opposite of what we did up here, where we switch the inputs around and we switch the view targets around. We want to undo that. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to set the view target back to the player's camera. So we can say set view target with blend. And again, you're going to need to uncheck this to see it. So there we go. And the target is, again, the player controller. So drag in the occupied player and say get controller. I did it again. I guess I have to compile for some reason in order to see this. Get controller. And again, we'll cast to player controller and make it pure cast. So this is our target. And the new view target is just our occupied player, because the occupied player has a camera associated with it. So Unreal is basically going to find that camera and use that camera. So that's all we need to do for that. And then again, we want to undo what we did up here, because remember before we disabled input for the player and we enabled it for ourselves. So we want to do the opposite. So we're going to enable it for the player. So drag in the occupied player and say enable input and hook that up. And it wants the player controller, so we can just drag that in, player controller, like so. And we want to disable it for ourselves. So right click and say disable input and leave target as ourselves. And the player controller gets hooked up to the player controller. And the very last thing we want to do is we want to set the occupied player to essentially nothing, so that we're basically telling it that there's no player currently occupying it anymore. And we need to do this so that when it comes up here and it checks if it's occupied, it's going to say no the next time, so that we can reoccupy it again. Okay, so we go ahead and run this. We should be able to exit out. So if I go up and press F, and then I press F again, you can see I'm back out and I have full control once again. And I can walk up and press F again, and press F again, and I can just do that as many times as I want, and it works. So the last thing we need to do is add support for multiple cameras so we can switch between them. So I'm just going to copy this guy and bring him somewhere else. So copy and paste. Actually, I'm not going to copy and paste. I'm just going to make a new one somewhere else. So drag in my security camera like so. Maybe we'll just put one there, and I'll just put one more just to keep things moving along. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but obviously you can put these wherever you want, and you can put as many of them as you want as well. Okay, so now I have one here, I have one here, and I have one over here. So again, we need to go up to our control panel and let it know about the new cameras we added. So plus plus, because we've added 2. So we got camera 2 and camera 3. So right now it's not going to do anything different because it doesn't have any code in it to switch between cameras. It's just going to always show us this camera. So we want to add support for switching to different cameras. So back in the project settings, under input, we can add 2 more action mappings. The first one we'll just call next camera. So this is the button we're going to press to move to the next camera. And I'm going to use the D key for this. If I can find the D key, there it is. And the next one is going to be called previous camera. And I'm going to set this to A, like so. All right, so back in our BP control panel, we want to listen for those events. So right click and say input action next camera and input action previous camera. Okay, so essentially all we need to do in here, we already have a lot of this code written, is we just need to increment the active camera or decrement it, depending on which way we're going, and then call set view target as active camera again. And one thing we need to make sure of is that, so currently we have 3 cameras attached. So if they press next, 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 and then next, they would technically be on index 4. We want it to loop around so that it goes 1, 2, 3, and then it goes back to 1, and then it goes 1, 2, 3, and then back to 1. So we want to add support for looping around if you just keep clicking next or previous. So to do that, I'm just going to create two simple functions, one for incrementing and one for decrementing, just so it's kind of contained. So we'll say increment camera index, and we want this to be private. Move it up to the private section, and I'm just going to duplicate this again and rename it to decrement camera index, like so. All right, so inside of here, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We just want to check, first and foremost, if the active camera index, if we add one to it, if we're going to be overflowing and if we should loop or not. So we're going to drag in the active camera index. We're going to say int plus, and we're going to leave this as 1. And we want to say, is this value greater than the security camera's last index? So again, if we have 3 security cameras, the last index is going to be 2 because arrays start at 0, so there's 0, 1, 2. So we're saying if the active camera index is greater than 2, that means we've surpassed the last camera in our array. Then we want to go back to the first camera. So we'll do a branch. And in order to go back to the first camera, we simply just need to set the active camera index to 0. Otherwise, we are not overflowing, and we can simply just increment this number. So we'll just drag this in and call increment int and hook that up to false. So we basically want to do something very similar for decrement. So open the decrement function, and we essentially kind of just want to do the opposite. Again, we want to drag in the get active camera, and instead of plus, we want to do int minus 1. And we want to make sure that this is, or we want to check if it becomes less than 0, because if it becomes less than 0, then obviously we want to go back up to 2 in this case, so it wraps around. So if it's less than 0, we just want to set it to whatever the last index is in our array. So we'll say security cameras get last, or I think it's just last index, yeah. Last index. And then if it's false, we just want to decrement it. So we'll say active camera, decrement int, and we'll hook it up to false, like so. All right, so now we have functions for incrementing and decrementing. So we can go back to our event graph, and it should be pretty easy at this point. If they press next camera, we're going to call increment camera index, and then we're going to call set view target as active camera. And if they decrement, or if they click previous camera, we're going to decrement the camera index, and again we're going to call set view target as active camera, like so. So now if we go ahead and compile and save this, and we run it, I walk up and press F, you can see I go to the first camera. If I press D, I go to the next. If I press A, it should go back, which it does. And then essentially, if you just keep clicking D, you see it just cycles between the cameras, and it will just keep looping. It does the same thing for previous. So again, you can just add as many cameras as you want, and just make sure that you also add them to this list whenever you add them to the world, and you should be good. So I think that pretty much concludes the tutorial. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks.